over 50 articles, and numerous, thank you, Meredith. I did forget to start the recording. I told you, Peter, I knew I would forget one of these things. All right, so Peter Meyler's research into Black history has led to 2 books, over 50 articles, and numerous presentations. He was a consultant for History Channel's award-winning series BLK, an origin story. He co-authored A Stolen Life, Searching for Richard Pierpoint, and edited Broken Shackles, Old Man Henson From Slavery to Freedom. Articles have appeared in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and Canada's National History magazine. He has uncovered information on a number of historic Black Canadians, including John Daddy Hall and Larry Gaines. Today, his topic is Richard Pierpoint, freedom fighter. Richard Pierpoint was African and one of Upper Canada's earliest settlers. He survived the transatlantic slave trade, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and 20 years of enslavement. The story of his life and times answers questions and challenges assumptions about Ontario's history. So we'll get our presentation up here, and Peter will take it away. Everyone can see my screen. It's just loading. There we are.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me talk about Richard Pierpoint. But he was someone I had never heard of until 1983. In that year, my hometown of Fergus was 150 years old, and a 2-volume history was produced, and it had a surprising revelation. There had been an African settler here before the Scottish arrived in 1833, and it was a chance phone call was the impetus for this to be known. Next slide. I thought that some memorial would eventually be created for him, but that didn't happen. So in 1994, I decided to create one myself. With the help of my family, I arranged a small project under the local marking program of the Ontario Heritage Foundation. Preliminary research showed that Pierpoint had a substantial presence in some major historical events. It also revealed a startling fact for me. Pierpoint's property was directly across the road from our house. We had fished on his property, drunk from the springs on his property, skated on the frozen ponds on his property. To top it off, the school we attended was right in the middle of his property. That is where our plaque still proudly stands. So that his story would not be forgotten again, my brother David and I continued our research, resulted in the publication of A Stolen Life, Searching for Richard Pierpoint in 1999. That is thanks to Barry Penhale and Jen Gibson of Natural Heritage Books. Next slide. But it was only because of one document that we could do this research. In 1821, Pierpoint had a petition prepared with 3 crucial facts. It began that Your Excellency's petitioner is a native of Bundu in Africa, that at the age of 16 years he was made a prisoner and sold as a slave, that he was conveyed to America about the year 1760 and sold to a British officer. We now have a location, Bundu, an age 16, and a date, 1760. Next slide. That we know where he is from is extremely rare for enslaved Africans. No, could you go back one?
Oh, yeah.
That's it. It's extremely rare that we know where he's from. Most mentions in historic records are of large areas with many nations such as Guinea or the Gold Coast. The country of Bundu is now part of Senegal, shown here in red. It's the most western country in Africa. The Senegal coast had been under French control, but the British had taken it over during the 7 Years' War. That's the same war that saw the British take over Canada in 1759. Next slide. Bundu was in the far east of what is now Senegal, near both the Senegal and Gambia rivers. It was surrounded by a number of other peoples and nation states shown on this 19th century map. As you can see, it was a small country, about 33,000 square kilometers and 30,000 inhabitants. Yeah, next slide. Incredibly, we were lucky. There were 2 books about Bundu. The first was the biography of Ayyub bin Suleiman, Job, son of Solomon in English. He had been captured about 30 years before Pierpoint. He was lucky to have had English benefactors buy his freedom from his Maryland owner. He was a member of a high-ranking clerical family. This painting was done in England and shows him as he would dress in Bundu. with his Koran hanging around his neck. He was from the Fulani people, as were the ruling family. The family and its followers ruled as absolute priest kings. It is likely that Pierpoint was Fulani as well, since they had an affinity to Bandu as a country. The second book is Pragmatism in the Age of Jihad by American scholar Michael Gomez. The title reflects Bandu's tolerance of various religious practices and ethnic groups. The book also provides a complete pre-colonial history of this small Islamic theocracy that had disappeared many years ago. Next slide. Bandu was an important trading nation with access to trans-Sahara traders and to the routes along the major rivers to the Atlantic. This rural Fulani village shows a typical layout with protecting walls enclosing crops, animals, and houses. Domestic products of the Bandu included cattle, millet, rice, ground nuts, raw cotton, and woven fabrics, which they were well known for. The society was divided into a caste system, usually divided by occupations and trades. It also included enslaved servants, usually due to debts owed or through military capture. However, it was not chattel slavery, and some enslaved would have a higher status than some free people. Next slide. All boys in Bandu went to school from around the age of 5 to 16. The local clerical leader, the imam, would be the teacher. The idea that all Africans were illiterate is shown to be a trope, since boys here were taught to read and write Arabic. Each family also had to provide a male family member for the Royal Army. Pierpoint at the age of 16 may have been one of them. In Bandu, it was illegal to sell a citizen into slavery outside of the country, so it is probable that Pierpoint was captured by external raiders. This is how one of the leaders in Bandu would look, the military leaders would look. Next slide. Once captured, he was trapped in the transatlantic slave trade. He would have been marched in a coffle such as this to either the Senegal or Gambia rivers, then taken to the coast. The enslaved were made to carry goods, and at times, if they didn't have goods to carry, they were made to just carry rocks, so they'd be tired out at the end of the day, so there'd be less chance of escape at night. He ended up in the British slavery system since it controlled both rivers in 1760. It is estimated that up to 20 million Africans were captured, with about 10 million reaching the Americas. The slave trade was essentially a trade in children, with the average age of a captive being 14 years old. Teenagers like Pierpoint were prime candidates, since they were easier to handle and had more years of labor ahead for future buyers. Next slide. We have an actual letter from a Boston merchant, Timothy Fitch, with orders to the captain of his ship, the Phyllis, for a voyage to Senegal in 1760, the year Pierpoint mentioned in his petition. He tells the captain, proceed directly to the coast of Africa, touching first at Senegal. Then come to anchor with your vessel and go up to the factory in your boat and see if you can part with any of your cargo to advantage. If you could sell the whole of your cargo there to a good profit and take slaves and cash, come directly home. Purchase your complete cargo of young slaves, which I suppose will be 70 or 80. He also advises, be sure to bring as few women and girls as possible. You see, in the northern colonies, households would only require 1 or 2 male slaves to help with farm work and manual labor. The people of Senegal call the small portholes here, shown here on Gorée Island, the doors of no return. Boats would be loaded here and ferry the captives to the waiting slave ships. 16-year-old Pierpoint was brought to one of the trading posts along the Atlantic coast, sold to a slaver, and disappeared from Africa. The average voyage would take about 2 months with a 10 to 20% death rate. We actually have records for the Phyllis, which made 2 voyages in 1760. The first with 95 captives, with 74 surviving, and on its second voyage, 96 captives with 75 people surviving. That is a 22% death rate. It was said that slave ships approaching port could often be smelled before they could be seen. Next slide. Pierpoint notes that he was bought by a British officer. The French and Indian War, part of the ongoing 7 Years' War, was just simmering down, but officers still needed personal servants. A bright-looking young African was a status symbol, as shown in this painting. Where Pierpoint arrived or who bought him is unknown. Richard was likely the name given by his first owner, but most enslaved people were not given a last name. A 1761 Boston paper carried a typical slavery ad. A parcel of likely Negroes from Africa, cheap for cash or short credit, inquired John Avery at his house, next door to said Avery's the still house. It continues. Also, if any persons have any Negro men, strong and hardy, though not of the best moral character, which are proper subjects for transportation, may have an exchange for small Negroes. Again, you could see that young Negroes were, young enslaved people were more likely to be sold in the northern colonies. You can imagine the teenage Pierpoint's despair, standing naked on an auction block with a treacherous future ahead of him. He was now enmeshed in a completely foreign existence, a different culture, a different landscape, different weather, food, customs, culture, and separated from family by thousands of miles of ocean. Next slide. He was also a British chattel slave. This meant that he was no longer a human being. He was property with no rights and no protection under the law. Beatings with boards, poles, and whips were routine, but more horrific punishments were also inflicted on Africans. These included branding, mutilation, amputations, and of course rape. In 1713, a New York military chaplain wrote, "The Negroes were much discouraged from embracing Christianity. Frequent discourse were made in conversations that they had no souls and perished as beasts." My research showed that there was no aspect of British enslavement that was benign for the enslaved. But Richard went through the arduous task of learning a new language and unfamiliar duties with the fortitude to survive. Slide 13. Next slide. Pierpoint's story remains dark to us until 1778. During my research, I serendipitously had asked the Orange River Library staff to retrieve a book for me. It was called Blacks Who Stole Themselves, Advertisements for Runaways in the Pennsylvania Gazette. When I received it through interlibrary loan, I found an ad from Sunbury, Pennsylvania, and it had the following in it. Richard Lincoln, formerly advertised as Pierpoint. So I had to find out which previous newspaper had that ad where it mentioned Richard Pierpoint. I found that the original ad for Richard Pierpoint was in another newspaper. It was only available on microfilm at Stanford University. The library did another request, and a few weeks later, the microfilm from California arrived. It contained the first mention of a black Richard Pierpoint. It began, "Was it committed to my custody the 23rd of October, 1778, of designing to go to the enemy, or being runaway slaves. Two Negro men, one named James Hayes, says he drove a team in the Continental Service. The other, named Richard Pierpoint, says he also drove a team in the Continental Service." The ad also contains the only description of him. It says, Richard Pierpoint is about 26 years of age, about 5'3" or 4 inches high, has large eyes and thick lips, seems fond of strong liquor, but is very civil and biteable. The later ad also mentions that he may be a barber, a skill required of an officer's servant. The building shown here sits in the middle of Sunbury. The basement windows were part of the below-ground jail cells in which Pierpoint was held for 2 years. Next slide. (1778) was the time of the American Revolution, and the Sunbury was home to Fort Augusta on the Susquehanna River. Pierpoint may have first been held in the fort after his capture, since he and Hayes were suspected of going to join the British. The Susquehanna was an important route for both wagon and boat transport of George Washington's supplies. Disrupting the supplies were Butler's Rangers, a guerrilla war outfit, and the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations or Iroquois. They created havoc for Washington's rebel army. In 1780, raids over just 3 days saw the destruction of 13 mills, 1,000 houses, and 600,000 bushels of grain. General Washington ordered a special expedition to go up the Susquehanna to destroy the Iroquois, as commemorated on this plaque. But spoiler alert, they weren't successful. Next slide. The Rangers were formed and led by John Butler. He had been one of the wealthiest men in colonial New York with a 26,000-acre estate. His very good friend, Sir William Johnson, owned 66,000 acres and was head of the Indian Department in New York. Johnson's second wife was Molly Brant, one of the most powerful Mohawk leaders. By 1780, the Butler's Rangers had 8 full companies, of which 2 were required to speak indigenous languages. Butler had close connections to the Haudenosaunee and to Molly's brother, the Mohawk war leader, Joseph Brant. In the United States, Butler had a reputation for brutality, and Brant was known as Monster Brant. Of course, for Canada, they were heroes and important founders of Ontario. Next slide. In 1779, the British offered freedom to any enslaved male when they joined the military. In December 1780, the first official record of Richard appeared as a member of Butler's Rangers. Based at Fort Niagara, they would journey as far as New Jersey, always recruiting along the way. The Rangers would travel through the forest, following trails and waterways, stealthily attacking and retreating as they went. They had been active only a day's march from Sunbury, but how or when Pierpoint joined the Rangers is unknown. He was noted as a pioneer in the records, the soldier who would go forward and break down doors and other impediments for the others to follow. This was a very dangerous role. The Americans never destroyed the Haudenosaunee or Butler and his Rangers. The American Revolution ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, with thousands of soldiers and loyalist refugees settled around the fort. Next slide. Unfortunately, the British gave all of northern New York to the Americans. Without any involvement of the Haudenosaunee, this included all of their fertile ancestral lands. Eventually, they were given land along the Grand River as compensation. The refugees and military now needed to be settled in Canada. After a number of years, land grants were given to what became known as the United Empire Loyalists. There were at least 1,000 blacks in the province at the time, but Pierpoint was one of about only 10 black men who made it on the Loyalist register. You see, a man of African descent was only allowed to have a land grant if he had fought as a free man for the British. Interestingly, Pierpoint was not alone at Fort Niagara. A 1784 Oath of Allegiance lists him with an unnamed woman. In 1786, he and a woman are noted in Murray's district, which became much of Grantham Township. Neither record indicates their relationship. On January 18, 1791, Pierpoint, generally known as Captain Dick, finally received 2 100-acre Grantham lots in what is now the center of St. Catharines. He must have had some prominence in the early community since Dick's Creek was named for him, and some of it still exists, and you can see it in the photograph. The creek became part of the first Welland Canal, and today the provincial historic plaque stands nearby. The next slide. Pierpoint was an integral part of the growing African-Canadian community. His name is found on this famous 1794 petition. 14 of Niagara's black residents had a number of solutions for problems they were facing. They wrote, "Your petitioners are desirous of settling adjacent to each other, that they may be enabled to give assistance in work to those amongst them who may most want it. Your petitioners therefore humbly pray that their situation may be taken into consideration. And if your excellency should see fit to allow them attractive country to settle on, separate from the white settlers, your petitioners hope their behavior will be such as to show that Negroes are capable of being industrious and in loyal to the crown they are not deficient." Next slide. The petition shows that work was hard to find for black men. The bigotry and prejudice in Upper Canada portrayed them as lazy and disloyal. They also did not receive land grants as did their white neighbors. We don't know why, but the petition was turned down by Lieutenant Governor Simcoe, even though he had enacted the anti-slavery law the year before. This law did not free any of those already enslaved in Upper Canada, since many of the provincial elite owned slaves. These same people may not have wanted a black enclave where escaped slaves could find refuge. The next record for Pierpoint comes on November the 11th, 1806, when Pierpoint parted with his Grantham properties. He sold one and traded the other to a son of a Butler's Rangers for a lot in Love Township, shown here in red, in the red box on the map. Next slide. Captain Dick again appears as a community leader with the threat of the war in 1812. This is known from a note by the Adjutant General of the militia added to the 1821 petition. It stated that Pierpoint was the first colored man who proposed to raise a corps of men of color on the Niagara frontier in the last American war. What became known as the Colored Corps was formed, and on September 1st, 1812, the 68-year-old African enlisted as a private. A Toronto volunteer had prepared his will before leaving for Niagara. It likely reflected the view of many members of the Corps. He wrote, I, Robert Scott of the town of York, in the home district of the province of Upper Canada, a free black man, taking into consideration the uncertainty of life, the more especially as I now am about to embark for Niagara, as a volunteer to defend my king and gracious sovereign, King George, the prince of the good and the enemy of slavery. So the Corps, using their personal weapons and without uniforms, were likely a skirmishing unit as shown here. From strategic positions, one man would stand and fire while the other kneeled and reloaded. Next slide. One of the first places I looked for Colored Corps information while doing research was in Richard Pierre Burton's War of 1812 books. I found one mention of it at Queenston Heights. Burton wrote, a quote, now the battle is joined. James Crook, advancing with his militia detachment, has been in many hailstorms, but none, he thinks wryly, where the stones fly thick as the bullets on this October afternoon. Little scenes illuminate the battle and remain with him for the rest of his days, such as the bizarre spectacle of Captain Robert Runchie's platoon of black troops, escaped slaves who have volunteered at Newark, advancing on the flank of the Indians, close quote. I had wondered what made the black troops look bizarre to Pierre Burton and Crook, so I searched up for Crook's original words. This is what Crook's actually wrote in his memoir. On the advance, I perceived an iron 6-pounder abandoned by the enemy, and as I was looking at it wistfully, an officer who had charge of a few colored men called out to me by name that it is not spiked. For this 19th century Canadian officer, he didn't mention anything that was bizarre, but by the 20th century, the black troops were considered weird in popular culture. There's another rare brief description in a report about Queenston Heights. The report reads, about 3 o'clock, General Schaeff advanced through the woods towards the battery on the mountain, with the main body and the field guns on the right. The Mohawk Indians, under Captain Norton and a Niagara company of blacks, proceeded along the brow of the mountain on the left, and our company of militia with the light company of the 49th broke through the center. Again, from this description, you can see that black troops being involved in the military was not unusual. The Colored Corps fought at many battles and skirmishes. At Queenston Heights, their commander was commended for his energetic performance here. The Corps was also noted at the Battle of Fort George, where they engaged the Americans at a distance of 6 to 10 yards with destructive and rapid fire. Military excursions were not the only danger during the war. Disease and deprivation were also deadly. Robert Scott, who wrote his will just months before, died of disease in January 1813. A month later, a fellow Corps member, John Jackson, also died of disease. As the militiamen fought for freedom, their families were also in peril. A claim for compensation made by the Peter Lee family shows this. In their claim, the Americans had stolen 14 hogs, 16 sheep, a heifer, furniture, bedspreads, a bed tick, a blanket, a brass candlestick, clothing, crockery, a tea kettle, and an iron pot. In addition, they destroyed 7 bushels of wheat and 40 bushels of potatoes during the war. Next slide. In the December of 1813, the Corps was given construction duties, including building the new Fort Mississauga and fortifying the captured Fort Niagara. The engineer and department commander wrote, when I visited the Niagara frontier, I found that a corps of free men of color had been turned over to that of the engineers. Any necessity for this I never could learn, but it seems to have been the fashion to heap all kinds of duties upon the latter. To me, it seems that the black soldiers were given some of the most dirty and dangerous jobs, reflecting their place in society at the time. Peter Lee was injured at Fort Niagara. A report after the war said that he had hurt his arm in the King's work, which is disabled, has 7 children in great distress. Things got worse for the Lee family when Peter died on January 1st, 1817 as a result of his injuries. But Pierpoint survived the war, and his service ended when the Corps was disbanded on March 24th, 1915.
Peter?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. We're just hearing a lot of feedback on your end, and I have everyone else muted, so I don't. Is it the papers might be too close to the mic? That's all.
Oh, could be. Okay, that's right. Is that
Oh,
okay
no,
now?
you're okay. It was starting to
Okay.
catch you. There we go.
Yes. So
Okay.
veterans were to receive 6 months' pay at the war's end, but as usual, the government had no money to pay them. Finally, in the spring of 1820, yeah, that's go before that, back. Oh, that's at the end.
My apologies. One sec here. I don't know why it jumped us to the back. Okay. Which slide were we on? We were on.
Yeah, go to
this one, right? Okay.
Yeah, and now the next one.
Next. Okay.
That's it.
There we go.
Finally, in the spring of 1820, it was announced that militiamen would receive a 100-acre grant of what was called the wastelands of Ontario, or the Crown. Pierpoint had no desire to start over again on a remote piece of land. This led to his 1821 petition with the following request. He finds it difficult to obtain a livelihood by his labor, and that he is, above all things, desirous to return to his native country. That His Majesty's government be graciously pleased to grant him any relief. He wishes it may be by affording him the means to proceed to England, and from thence to a settlement near the Gambia or Senegal rivers, from whence he could return to Bondu. At 76 years of age, the old African just wanted to go home. Next. But that didn't happen. The location ticket for the east half of Lot 6 on the first concession in Garifraxa Township was issued in 1822. Dissected by the Grand River, it is shown here in the bottom left-hand corner of the map of Garifraxa Township. The settlement duties required were to clear and fence 5 acres of every 100 acres granted, to erect a dwelling house of 16 by 20 feet, and to clear 1/2 of the road in front of each lot. Another Corps member received a grant close by. This was John Van Patten, whose father had been an enslaved servant of Joseph Brant. By 1823, he had fulfilled the settlement duties and sold his property since he had work in the Burlington area. Other settlers in the first concession were 3 members of the Wintermute family, all descendants of Butler's Rangers officers. They lived on the same road and at the same time as Pierpoint. Next. Pierpoint was 81 years old when the settlement duties were completed. This had to have been accomplished with the help of Niagara Friends and residents of the Queensbush settlement. The Queensbush was about 20 miles west and the largest black settlement in Upper Canada at the time. On May 9, 1825, Levi Johnson and John Brown attested that the duties were complete. Both men were black residents of Waterloo Townships, which was part of the Queensbush settlement. Pierpoint would not have stayed in the Garifraxa area during the winter. 2 young Scotsmen had described a winter stay in a cabin along the river, likely one of the Wintermute cabins about 2 lots down from Pierpoint. They recall the temperature dropping to -30 degrees and that everything inside the cabin would freeze. The fireplace was kept going all the time and the cabin would fill with smoke since the door needed to be kept closed to keep the wolves out. Of course, the Niagara area would be much more accommodating for the old man. Next. You can tell that Pierpoint had some sophistication about the law when he had the foresight to prepare his will. Please note that it is the only physical artifact we have of Pierpoint, as it contains his thumbprint and X mark, as highlighted here in the slide. Written in Niagara in January 1828, the document notes that he is weak, but in his perfect senses. It also notes that he has no heirs nor relations. Of course, this does not mean that he did not have a family earlier in his life. The will notes 2 properties, the Garifraxa lot and one in Grantham Township. There's no mention at all of the Louth Township property. And the Land Registry Office has a mystery in its entries about this lot. There's an 1834 registration of the sale of the property, but it is for a sale made in 1826 by a man from John Thompson to a man named Adam Haynes. There's no record of Pierpoint selling the land at all. Makes you wonder if he had traded the property as before or someone had swindled it out of him. Next one. There's another record that casts a light on Pierpoint's circumstances in 1828. He is listed on what was called a record called Money of Paid on Accounts of Paupers in April of that year. This document hints where he may have lived at that time in 1828, since he left all of his possessions to Lemuel Brown. Brown was the head of a large household in Grantham Township, and Pierpoint may have been one of the 7 males noted. When we produced our book, we knew little of Lemuel Brown. This changed at an event at the Collingwood Library when I showed Janie Cooper Wilson a copy of Pierpoint's will in A Soul and Life. Tears came to her eyes as she saw the name Lemuel Brown. He is her great-great-grandfather. So now we knew that he had moved north to Grey County and then on to Collingwood. Next slide. A few years ago, a fellow researcher discovered an article called Uncle Tom's Prototype, published in 1907. On reading it, I realized that it was the first-hand account of Lemuel Brown. From this, we knew he was born in Vermont around 1800, but did not know who his parents were. Enslavement of children was still allowed there at the time. During the War of 1812, Lemuel's second owner sold him to an American officer, Colonel Daniel Bissell. In 1814, now General Bissell was transferred to Buffalo, where he subsequently lost Lemuel in a gambling wager with another officer. The teenage slave went from the frying pan into the fire with his new owner. After being repeatedly beaten and mistreated, Lemuel made the harrowing escape across the Niagara River. Unfortunately, the article ended at this point, so we don't know how or when he came to know Pierpoint. Next slide. Another rare record that showed up was found by the Niagara on the Lake Museum. It is a notice published in an 1830 newspaper. Lemuel Brown stated that his wife, Rosanna, had absconded and that no one should be harboring or trusting her. Another personal fact appeared later in his daughter Susan's 1925 obituary, where it stated that she was one of 17 children. Next slide. Lemuel appears in later records with his new wife, Phoebe Workman, who was Susan's mother. This naturalization record shows him in various places over the years. The interesting thing here is that he signed his name, which meant that he could read and write. Other black men on this record signed with just an X. Next slide. On September 27, 1838, Lemuel Brown made his way to Niagara. The following day, he attended the surrogate court with the will of Richard Pierpoint. The clerk recorded the following on the government form. I, Lemuel Brown of the county of Halton in the Gore district, farmer, executor of the last will and testament of Richard Pierpoint, late of Grantham, in the said district, yeoman, deceased. This is the only indication that the African exile had died. There is no record of the date or place of Pierpoint's death. People in Fergus claim that he was probably buried on or near his property there. Meanwhile, those in St. Catharines claim the same thing. Lemuel and Phoebe sold the Garifraxa property to the neighboring farmer in 1839. The last government record that mentions Richard Pierpoint is an 1844 letter which denied the Browns ownership of the Grantham property. It's after this date that the Brown family moved north to the Durham Roads black settlement, and then later, in old age, Lemuel and Phoebe moved into Collingwood with one of their children. The last historic mention of Richard Pierpoint appeared in a St. Catharines newspaper article in 1856. It reads, Captain Dick, colored, who owned 100 acres nearby, was said to have buried a considerable amount of money when on his deathbed tried to disclose its whereabouts, but was too far gone and failed. The property changed in the course of time into several hands, and if report be true, each one has plowed, digged, uprooted, and ransacked it pretty freely. And of course, we already knew that in 1828 he got money as a pauper, so it's not likely that he had buried a treasure somewhere on his land in St. Catharines. So from this newspaper article, we know that Pierpoint had been known in local folklore, but not in our history books. Next slide. There's an African saying that goes, only when lions have historians will hunters cease being heroes. For over 100 years, there was little interest in writing about the remarkable life of Richard Pierpoint. The legacy of African settlers in Canada was almost never included in books about the country's development, but scant historical records and an oral history of this African warrior made it possible to bring him out of his shadows. There are still inaccuracies in some stories being told about him, but Captain Dick's legacy has been acknowledged now in a Canadian Heritage Minute, at least 3 books on local, provincial, and national plaques, on government buildings in Ontario and Senegal, and on parks in St. Catharines and central Wellington. These are tributes for a life that was lived with hope, determination, and courage. Next slide. So I would like to thank you very much for allowing me to tell you a little bit about Richard Pierpoint, and any comments or questions are very welcome. Thanks.
All right, let's just open up the chat here. Thank you so much for coming today, Peter. This was great. Okay, so I'm just scrolling down through the chat. There's not. Okay, so we had a question about a trigger warning. We've handled that. Thank you for addressing that, Cindy. Alex had the interference, so thank you for that. All right, so I see Rachel's typing here. Oh, thank you, that was really interesting. So Peter, with all the news items with everything that's coming about in research today, with new ways to look through historical documents and understand like what was happening in the past, do you foresee finding more information on Richard to fill out this story?
You can never tell, because more and more things are being digitized, and so once that happens, there's always a chance that there might be a mention of him somewhere. Because what's really missing is where he might have passed away and where he was buried. But again, there's no record of that, so it could have been on his land or on his private property.
For sure. And Michelle here is asking, Peter, where does your interest come from in that you wanted to study Black history?
Well, it came from, again, Richard Pierpoint. When I found out that there was a Black settler in our area, and that was even before I realized his land was across the road. No, I was upset by that, because that was not left out by accident. Because Fergus had 2 very early histories written, like one in the 1930s and one maybe even a little earlier. So there were people still alive when those people were doing the writing, who would have known, who were living in the area at the time. But that's what I found in histories, is that it's either through prejudice or ignorance. Like prejudice because they don't want to include them, or ignorance because they don't know how a Black person would fit into the history. It's like with Pierre Burton's book, where he calls them bizarre. Like, there's nothing bizarre about them. But I have another really concrete. It's when Dufferin County was their centennial, and they did a history volume, and they didn't mention any Black settlers at all. But there had been a history done of Dufferin County around 1940, which mentioned Black residents in the county. So again, obviously the person doing the 1970 book would have had the 1940 book as a reference. But again, they just left them completely out of the history.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. We also have another question here from Alexander. Is Pierpoint's story unusual? Do we know if there are other Africans and formerly enslaved people like him who ended up in Upper Canada / Ontario over the years? And then he notes that obviously there were Black settlers and residents, but how much of theirs were their stories like Pierpoint's?
Well, there's quite a lot because, again, with Butler's Rangers, there were other Black members of Butler's Rangers, and again, once freedom was offered by the British, a number of them joined. But there's some unusual ones, like with John Butler, he had slaves, and one of his, and they fought with him during the war, but they couldn't get land because they weren't free when they were fighting during the war. Um, and one of the one of the sons of the slaves what had to be bought by his own father from Butler so he could be free. There was a lot of things going on that there were quite a number, and there was actually another person from Africa listed as a member of the Colored Corps. So again, his story I don't know at all, but Pierpoint's Pierpoint's story is unusual because he had that petition written for him. So you had a starting point for some research. The other interesting thing with Pierpoint, though, he was in Niagara 1780, died in 1838, but he never was in any census record. So we never knew where he lived or how family members. Um, so, and quite often, if you were a Black person in Upper Canada, you might not want to tell the census taker who lives there, how many people, because slave raiders would come up. They would come up to steal people and bring them back. That happened. It's a famous one during the War of 1812. John Daddy Hall, who I did a lot of research in, again, he ended up in Owen Sound, but he and I think 11 other family members were captured by Virginia soldiers and taken into slavery during the second or the War of 1812.
Michelle says, thank you for your inclusion. And does anyone else have any further questions for Peter today? Okay, I have one more. Oh, one more from me, Alexander. All right, one. Alexander, you can come off mute too and ask your question if you'd like.
Sure, thank you. I can probably speak a little more clearly than I can.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for this. I always find it so um, fascinating how the history, whenever you peel the onion layers back, is always more complex than you ever think it will be, and it's never monochrome in any sense of that word. So thanks for revealing some of this and also the richness of history as it really is, which I think is what Black History Month is all about. One question I did have, it occurred to me, you talked about Pierpoint service in the Butler's Rangers, and I'm just interested if any of the descendants of Black settlers from that generation, if any of them served in other conflicts, either with the British military, or I wonder if any of them were active in India, for example, or I know that there are a number of people
Oh,
in British North America who went and served in the Union Army during the Civil War, during the U.S. Civil War. I'm wondering if any of the descendants of these former slaves in Upper Canada that we were talking about might have been among them. I'm just sort of interested in how, you know, just because the British Empire was so extended and had so many military engagements, I'm just wondering if people like Pierpoint, possibly, who would come through British North America, might have popped up in other places too. Just interested if you know a little bit more about that.
well, the most famous one is he's from Nova Scotia, and I just forget his name now. He got a Victoria Cross um, for service in India. So I'm not sure what year he was in. It was in India for the British, but there's another really interesting one from Toronto, where I think it was the Solicitor or Attorney General of the province. He had an enslaved family who worked for him, but he died shipwreck in the Lake Ontario, and in his will he freed his slaves. So one of his other enslaved that was on the ship with him and died, but his brother, he joined the military in about 1805, 1806, which was a regular British army group, but it was based out of New Brunswick. And so he fought during the War of 1812, but he later mentions that he was at the Battle of Waterloo. And so, like most military historians don't believe that, but the thing is, it's possible because obviously the War of 1812 had ended here. They were still fighting. The British were still fighting in Europe, and if that's been his occupation for 7 or 8 years already, I don't think it would be unusual for him to join British military going back to Europe just to continue his service and keeping his work going. So you do find them. A lot of them also volunteered with militia during the 1837 rebellions. And also they joined when they had militia raised during the Fenian raids. So they do end up in different places.
Michelle gave us a name. It's William Hall from Nova Scotia.
That's right, William Hall. Yeah. Yeah, very famous.
Yeah. All right. And Peter, was there anything during your research that you were super, super excited about? Because I feel like when you saw the ad from like the Pennsylvania, it really just probably sparked you to go that much further, right? Like it would be an interesting mix for like a historian to find that one random tidbit and then it explodes to the rest of your research.
Well, that's why you come across so many interesting stories, and that's why when I was doing research, one of the very first books you read is called The Freedom Seekers by Daniel Hill. And that's where I saw a picture of John Daddy Hall from Owen Sound. And what it intrigued me, he was Indigenous and African background. And really, I had never heard of that. So when you hear that, then you start doing the research. And if you can find more information, it keeps going. But there are so many interesting stories. Like I was telling, like Peter Lee, the one who died after being injured at Fort Niagara. His family, like his son ended up moving up to the Old Durham Road Pioneer or settlement there, and eventually his descendants moved to Collingwood, and they were there for many years. And so that's another really interesting story that ties back to the local history here. And that's why you see you have to attach all this history to world events because it's not isolated. It didn't happen in this place. They have connections everywhere. Like Peter Lee, his descendant became one of the top scientists working for the U.S. military and got the highest civilian award that you can get from the U.S. military. And so again, that history ties back all the way to the American Revolution, when the first person from the Lee family arrived as a free man during the American Revolution around Amherstburg. So it's tied everywhere. So that's the important thing, is to connect this history together and not isolate it.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Does anyone else have any further questions for Peter? Oh, Natasha, do you want to come off mute, or you can type it out? Up to you.
Yeah, I'll come off mute. It's easier. Hi, Peter. Thanks for
Hi.
This was really interesting. I guess for me, this course was actually recommended by my son's school. So I guess from an education perspective, as we learn about all these people and more information's found, and there's more of a highlight of the contributions of African and Black descendant people with Canada, I guess how do you as historians help to bring this to the education system? I feel like a lot of times certain things are kind of glossed over or missed.
Yeah.
Just for Black History Month.
Yeah. See, and that's a really difficult part. I know Ontario has a new initiative to have Black history as part of the curriculum. See, a lot of it comes with teachers themselves who are interested in it will add it, but it was never required. There's nothing really required of it. So that's what needs to change. And so hopefully now with this new initiative that will change, because I know that series BLK, An Origin Story, the production company has been trying to get school boards interested in using the documentaries as part of the curriculum, but it's hard slogging trying to get that done.
Yeah,
Thank
lots
you.
more work to do, but this is a great start just to hear about it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And Michelle agrees. Thank you so much. You hit it right on the mark. There you go. All righty. So if everyone is all good, we do have Peter's contact. So if anyone wants to reach out, I'm sure you'd be happy to answer further questions later. But we thank you. Oh, Cindy's typing. I don't know if it's a question or not. So we'll just, thank you all.
Oh.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us today, Peter. We really appreciate you taking the time to go over Richard Pierpoint with us. And thank you to everyone who has joined in our Black History Month lecture series. And if you've missed any of the previous ones, you can catch them on YouTube or through our website at the moment. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right, recording has stopped.